I think, I don't want to literally speak for them, but I think if you put the CEOs of the big companies under truth serum, I think what they would say is their big fear is that AI is actually not going to lead to a monopoly for them. It's going to lead to a commodity. It's going to lead to a sort of a race to the bottom on price. And you see that a little bit now, which is people who are using one of the big models APIs are able to swap to another big model API from another company pretty easily. And then, these models, the business model, the main business model for these big models, at least so far, is an API, basically pay per token generated or per answer. And so, like, if these companies really have to compete with each other, like it may be that it actually is a hyper competitive market. It may be the opposite of like a search market or like an operating system market. It may be a market where there's just like continuous competition and improvement and leapfrogging, and then constant price competition. And then, of course, the payoff from that is, to everybody else in the world is like an enormously vibrant market where there's constant innovation happening, and then there's constant cost optimization happening. And then as a customer, downstream of this, the entire world that's going to use AI is going to benefit from this kind of hyper competition that's going to, could potentially run for decades. And so I think if you put these CEOs in a truth serum, what they would say is that's actually their nightmare. Like
yeah.
that.
Well, that's why they're in Washington.
That's why they're in Washington. So that is what's actually happening. That is the scenario they're trying to prevent. They are actually trying to shut out competition. And by the way, I will tell you this: there is a funny thing. Tech is so historically bad at politics that I think some of these folks think they're being very clever in how they go about this. And so, because they show up in Washington with the kind of kind of public service narrative or end of the world narrative or whatever it is, and I think they think that they're going to very cleverly kind of trick people in Washington into giving them a sort of cartel status, and the people in Washington won't realize until it's too late. But it actually turns out people in Washington are actually quite cynical.
They've been lobbied before.
Exactly. And so there is this thing, and I get this from them off the record a lot, especially after a couple of drinks, which is basically, if you've been in Washington for longer than 2 minutes, you have seen many industries come to Washington, many big companies come to Washington and want monopoly or cartel kind of regulatory protection. And so you've seen this, and if you're in Washington, you've seen this play out, in some cases, the guys have been there for a long time, dozens or hundreds of times. And so my sense is, like 9 months ago or something, there was a moment where it seemed like the big tech companies could kind of get away with this. I think it's actually, I think actually it's the edges. I'm still concerned, and we're still working on it, but I think the edges come off a little bit, because I think the cynicism of Washington in this case is actually correct. And I think they're kind of onto these companies. And then, look, if there's a unifying issue, there's basically two unifying issues in Washington. One is they don't like China, and the other is they don't like big tech. Yeah. And so, this is a winnable war. Like this is a winnable war on behalf of startups and open source, and freedom and competition. And so, I'm actually, I'm worried, but I'm feeling much better about it than I was 9 months ago.
Yeah. Well, look, we had to show up. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, it's taught me a real lesson, which is, you can't expect people to know what's in your head. You've got to go see them. You've got to put in the time. You've got to kind of say what you think. And then, and if you don't have any right to like wring your hands with how bad things are.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to know one more thing, just for says the Meta. You kind of mentioned the big companies being Microsoft, Google, Meta. It is worth noting Meta is on the open source side of this. And so Meta's actually working quite hard, and this is a big deal because it's very contrary to the image I think people have of Meta over prior issues, correctly or not. But on the open source AI topic and on freedom and innovate, at least for now, Meta is, I think, very strongly on that side. I
think that's right. It's actually a very interesting point, and kind of I think essential for people to understand is that the way Meta is thinking about this and the way that they're actually behaving and executing is very similar to how Google thought about Android, where their main concern was that Apple not have a monopoly on the smartphone. Not so much that they make money on the smartphone themselves, because a monopoly on the smartphone for Apple would mean that Google's other business was in real jeopardy. And so they ended up being kind of an actor for good. And, Android's been an amazing thing for the world, I think, including getting smartphones in the hands of people who wouldn't be able to get them otherwise, all over the world. And Meta is doing kind of a very similar effort where, in order to make sure that they have AI as a great ingredient in their products and services, is willing to open source it and kind of gives all of their very, very kind of large investment in AI to the world, so that, entrepreneurs and everybody can kind of keep them competitive, even though they don't plan to be in the business of AI in the same way that, like Google is in the business of smartphones to some extent, but it's not their kind of key business. And, Meta doesn't have a plan to be in the AI business. Maybe, to some extent they will but that's not the main goal.
And then I would put one other company on the concerning side on this, and it's too early to tell, but where they're going to shake out. But Amazon just announced they're investing a lot more money in Anthropic. So I think they're now basically Amazon is to Anthropic what Microsoft is to OpenAI.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. Yep.
Yeah, and so like there's a but Anthropic is very much in the group of kind of big tech, kind of new incumbent big tech, lobbying very aggressively for regulation and regulatory capture in DC. And so I think it's sort of an open question whether Amazon is going to pick up that agenda as OpenAI, as Anthropic increasingly becomes effectively a subsidiary of Amazon.
Yeah, well, this is another place where we're on the side of Washington D.C. and the current regulatory motion, where the big tech companies have done this thing, which we thought was illegal because we observed it occur at AOL and people went to jail, but what they've done is they invest in startups, huge amounts of money. Microsoft and Amazon and Google are all doing it, like billions of dollars, with the explicit requirement that those companies then buy GPUs from them at like not the discount that they'd ordinarily get, but at a relatively high price, and then be in their clouds. So that kind of, and then, in the Microsoft case, even more aggressive, give me your source code, give me your weights, which is like extremely aggressive. So, they're moving money from the balance sheet to their P&L, in a way that, at least from an accounting standpoint, it was our understanding wasn't legal. And the FTC is, looking at that now, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, well, that's one area. Another issue, that people should watch is, that's one that's around tripping. The other one is just consolidation. If you own, half of a company, and you get to appoint the management team, is that not a subsidiary? There are rules on that. Like at what point you
own the company equity, you own the intellectual property of the company, and you control the management team. Yeah. Is that not your company?
Yeah. And then at that point, if you're not consolidating it, like, is that legal? And so the SEC is going to weigh in on that. And then, of course, to the extent that some of these companies have nonprofit components to them, there's, tax implications to the conversion to for-profit and so forth. And so like there's a lot of, the stakes in the legal, I would say the stakes in the legal, regulatory, and political game that's being played here, I think are quite high.
Quite high. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Extreme.
Ben and I, as Ben mentioned this, Ben and I are old enough where we do know a bunch of people who've gone to jail. So some of these issues turn out to be serious.